he often either gets ignored or kind of laughed at as not a serious candidate.
Journalist Ryan Grimm, who works for The Intercept and is also a contributor to TYT, was on MSNBC where he called them out on air over their Bernie blackout, while also calling out other networks and media outlets for the same thing. Now, this video that I'm going to show you here is actually recorded off of television, and this is actually also a part of the story, which I'll get to after the clip.
The Sanders event, Ryan, was in this context, you said, of the sort of plateau. And I think that the one kind of consistent polling story we've seen over the last 3 months is that Elizabeth Warren has gained across polling. That the challenge for the Sanders campaign, and I thought it was interesting them doing the event where they did it with the numbers they did, is that his challenge is just building out from the core they have. They obviously have a core of supporters extremely devoted. But I thought the last part of riff of his speech was about fighting for people that don't look like you, and like seemed to me a rhetorical leaning into the idea of addition to the coalition in a way I hadn't quite heard him make the case before.
I mean, that's kind of been their kind of underlying case the entire time. And the good news for Sanders is that you can't survey his strategy. In other words, pollsters look for likely voters. And the way that they look for likely voters is, what's the electorate looked like in the past and what are our projections about what it's likely to look this time? Whereas Sanders is trying to change the complexion and the face of the electorate. So he's trying to organize enough people and inspire enough people in Iowa particularly, to come out and caucus for Bernie Sanders. He's running up against this huge problem, though, that I mentioned earlier, of this media blackout. In the Democratic primary, this network and the New York Times have an enormous amount of influence. And this show in particular is an exception. It covers Sanders pretty regularly, but outside of that, he often either gets ignored or kind of laughed at as not a serious candidate, even when polls come out showing him in reasonable contention.
Yeah.
And one quick point on the Buttigieg, he's spent an extraordinary amount of money in Iowa. And we can't forget that, because you can move the needle several points by dumping a ton of money into a state. And he's been very smart about burning a ton of money in those states to make himself look viable until he becomes viable.
All right. So many great points from Ryan Grimm here. I'm glad that Chris Hayes had him on. Again, Chris Hayes is really one of the few hosts on the network that is actually doing some good reporting. Again, I don't agree with everything he does. I don't agree with most of the guests that he has on, but he will occasionally have a guest on like Ryan Grimm that tells it like it is. Now, so in terms of Grimm's point here, so Bernie is trying to sort of build this new coalition, trying to get out non-voters, and the best way to reach non-voters is through traditional media. But if your message is not getting out through traditional media, then it's a lot harder to get to those non-voters to excite them out to vote and support you. Now, as Ryan Grimm says there, it's because of the Bernie blackout. Networks like MSNBC, CNN, and others are barely covering him. And this is something I actually tweeted about on Sunday, because on purpose, I recorded each of the Sunday morning political shows. So there's one on CNN, NBC, ABC, and CBS. I recorded all of them. Not one of them covered the Bernie rally. Not one of them mentioned how Bernie Sanders had the biggest rally of the entire election season. Not one of the Sunday morning political shows just the day after Bernie had this rally mentioned that. The one that came closest was now I'm forgetting. It was the one hosted by George Stephanopoulos. So he mentioned that Bernie had a rally, but if you watch that clip, I'm not going to play it, but the whole purpose of that clip was to mention the AOC endorsement and then talk about how Bernie's actually sixth in endorsements in terms of Democratic Congresspeople. So like they only covered the Bernie rally to say that he's sixth place in endorsements. They didn't actually say how many people were at the rally. They didn't say it was the biggest rally of the entire election season among any candidate. Didn't mention any of that. They just used that segment to actually slam Bernie Sanders. And on top of that, The View, which is based in New York, also didn't cover it. The View covers big political topics. You'd think a massive rally that was in New York would be covered by The View, which is also in New York, and they cover politics fairly regularly. And they talk about people like AOC occasionally, which is in the news. Didn't mention this at all. Didn't mention her endorsement. Didn't mention the rally. Nothing. These are just a couple examples, but it's a widespread thing. And if you talk to your friends and family who maybe aren't as engaged in political news, aren't covering this stuff as closely, ask them if they even know that Bernie had a rally, had the biggest rally of the entire election, had AOC endorsed him, among other people like Michael Moore, who also endorsed him. Ask your friends and family if they even know about this. So I saw this one tweet, and again, this is anecdotal, but I think this is something that a lot of people can relate to. So Charlie Kane tweeted this out saying, talk to a lefty who watches cable news most nights and is generally more informed than most without being a political junkie. She had no idea Bernie was back from his heart attack, that he had a huge rally, or that AOC had endorsed him. The media blackout is real. So again, that's an anecdotal case, but ask your friends and family. See if they know about this. And also, if they don't, it's time to start sharing these stories with them. Get them involved and make them understand what is actually going on in this primary and who these candidates are. Now, the second main point I want to get to that I teased before the clip, this clip was shot off a television. Now, when I do these kinds of stories, oftentimes the first clip will come off a television. I'll see it on Twitter, and then I can find the actual clip if I go to YouTube, if I go to the actual official website. MSNBC didn't post this anywhere. They didn't post this on YouTube. They didn't post it on Twitter. They didn't even post it on their official website, msnbc.com. In fact, when you go to the page, so this segment was from Monday, the 21st. You go to their page, you can see Wednesday here has a lot of clips up, or about 5 or more. Tuesday has 4 clips. Then you go to Monday. Only 3 clips. And again, you see here Friday last week had 4 clips. Monday, only 3 clips. So every other day has at least 4 clips. Monday only had 3 clips. Why? Because they didn't post this video. They didn't want to share this. So not only is there a Bernie blackout, there is a blackout about the Bernie blackout. Like, there's levels to this. It's obvious. You've seen my coverage of how the media covers or doesn't cover Bernie Sanders. There was a story I covered over the weekend where The Hill posted a poll. I believe it was from Emerson Polling, I'm not positive, but they posted a poll showing that the headline said, Warren and Biden lose to Trump in Iowa. But the actual story of that poll was that Bernie Sanders is the only candidate that defeated Trump in that poll in Iowa. But they didn't mention him in the headline at all. It was about Warren and Biden losing to Trump. And this kind of thing is constant. It's not just that he is smeared in the press, which also happens, but the real issue is that he's largely ignored because it is hard to write negative stories about somebody who has been this consistent for 40 years, who actually fights for what he believes in. Not to mention, has the biggest grassroots base, has the most individual donors by far, is the only candidate to reach 1 million donors, and he reached that 2 months ago now. Has the most individual donations by far, has the, in terms of dollar-wise, has the lowest amount of individual donations at $18 a piece, showing you he actually has, his supporters are actually real people. He doesn't have any private fundraisers, no super PACs, no big donor money, no corporate money, none of that. He only represents the people, and the corporate media almost never covers him. Understand, they have a particular bias. So just like I have a bias, my bias is towards the average person. That's who I care about. The corporate media's bias is towards the wealthy, is towards massive corporations. So if they have a candidate who is a solid candidate with a huge support base, a huge grassroots support base, and a message that people can attach themselves to, like Bernie Sanders does, they're just not going to cover him because it impacts them negatively. It impacts their wealth and their power. So the only way to get the message out about Bernie Sanders is to spread videos like this. And not just my video, other people that cover this news, websites that report on Bernie Sanders. You have to spread this message to your friends and family. Otherwise, nobody's going to hear about him.